Gently round the minute I'll be free, and you'll be splashing in the sea. I feel no curiosity. I see the path ahead of me. In a minute I'll be free, and you'll be splashing in the sea. We'll hear a tiny cry as the ship goes sliding by. Free.
Do a nice fade out.
Nice fade out. That is the quarantine anthem, "Free" by America's greatest rock and roll band, Phish. I am
No.
Keatts. I'm joined by my friend MacKenzie Elmer for Voice of San Diego at home. MacKenzie, what's up?
Oh, just joining you for your Phish lecture. Isn't that what this is?
Well, so you want to hear it? So we're bouncing around the room, right? And in it will be free. So it's aspirational that the quarantine will end at some point in the future. Will be free, right?
I'm hoping so.
And you'll be free from having to hear me talk about Phish in about 20 minutes. All right, so we both did stories this week on related matters, the City of San Diego's Complete Communities program. Do you want to take a crack at explaining the highest level possible idea of what the Complete Communities program is?
I would prefer that you do, and then I'll talk about my small portion and contribution.
All right, fair enough. So Complete Communities is basically just a package of programs that the mayor's office has sort of combined together thematically. And they are all related to development and parks and transportation and the way we live. So they are very related, but they kind of break down into a bunch of separate categories. So one of those categories is a housing plan. This would be an optional program for developers. If they chose to participate, they would only be allowed to do so if they were going to build a project on an area that was already zoned for multifamily housing, so apartments or townhouses, and that was near a transit stop or a bus line. And if they did opt into the program, they would get a host of benefits in terms of being allowed to build more housing, bigger buildings, more homes. And in exchange, they would reserve some of those homes for low-income residents. They would pay a different fee structure towards community benefits and that sort of thing. And then there's also a transportation component, which actually has to do with a relatively complicated state law having to do with greenhouse gas emissions. So those two things are moving through the city council right now. And then the piece you wrote about was a change to how the city funds parks and sort of a city's attempt to address a long-standing inequity in the way park funding is handled as it pertains to new development. You want to go through that a little bit?
Right, yeah. So it's going to start with parks and then potentially be applied to the way we fund other things like libraries, fire, and even police actually could be funded through this, and is in like very small areas, which could be interesting if it actually expands that. But yeah, so this actually came out of a discussion over the Parks Master Plan, which is another big piece of policy moving through government right now. But what I found interesting was the fact that the way that we in our neighborhoods get money to build parks is via new development. And so developers come in, and when they want to build a project, they have to pay a fee that is essentially applied to a list of things that each neighborhood puts together and says that they want in their neighborhood. But it actually doesn't always work out that way in terms of like getting those projects funded. But what it showed is the way that these fees, which are really boring to talk about, but they actually make a big impact on the community that you live in, is that in newer communities, they have a developer fee structure that's structured in such a way that developers pay much, much more to the neighborhoods that are newer to build parks. So you can see right here, here's a chart I put together based on like the historic funding for each neighborhood. You can see like, what's that first neighborhood? North University had like over $230 million it's gotten from developers since they had a developer fee in place. And there's various years which each neighborhood has had it. And you can see the older communities that have been around San Diego the longest and traditionally now are very built out, and there's not a lot of land for new development. They have very little amounts that they've collected for these fees, and therefore their parks, as my story said, kind of suck more. So
Yeah. I mean, I guess one way to look at it is that this structure really only works, or it works best, maybe I should say, if you've got a new development that's getting started and you know that they're going to build 1,000 new homes in the next 5 years or so. Then you can charge all of those 1,000 homes a very specific fee. You know the money's going to come in. You know it's going to come in a relatively short order, and so you can plan for what you're going to build. And so if you look at, in that chart, all of those communities to the far left of the chart are new communities that are master planned, basically, that were all developed more or less at one time, right? Mm-hmm. Because you can get.
Is that what you mean by a master planned?
Yeah, master plan, right? And so you can get a lump. You can count on getting a large sum of money, and therefore you can reasonably plan around what to build with it. Whereas in a community like Golden Hill, where I live, they can update their fee structure, and they can say we're going to charge X amount of dollars per unit. But the community's already basically built out. Every few years, there's going to be some new project that puts in, 10 units or something like that. Maybe in there will be something really big at some point. But it's just going to be a trickle of money. There's never going to be a faucet just turned on. It's always going to be a trickle of money. And as long as that's the case, you can never really plan to build anything in any real large, meaningful way. You just have to sit around and let it accumulate for a very long time.
Right. And from what I understand too, like if you want to build some new apartments in an existing building, like let's say there's an old warehouse, you want to put a bunch of apartments in it, I'm pretty sure that you still don't get developer fees for your parks through that kind of a development. It has to be like on new greenfield or green land, like on touched green space, which is like why the newer communities have so much more money. And the other thing is that there's actually a secondary fee called the facilities benefit, I think, fee. And they can charge developers for like 100% of the future needs that they have planned for their community. So they can rake in much, much more from the developer that way. And so that's why you see those newer communities also have both a development impact fee and a facilities benefit fee, which
and those two things they're technically difficult or technically different, but they both skew the incentives in the same way.
Yes.
Which newer communities and wealthier communities are positioned to benefit from it more significantly. So one of the things that we should have you get into is not only would this change the amount that is charged in these communities, but it actually also changed the way it is apportioned. So a project now that's built in, say, Carmel Valley, that collects a hypothetical $1 million, they're actually going to redistribute that money into underserved parts of the city.
Right. So the city's proposing to essentially take they're going to grandfather in, like they're not going to touch any of the money that exists in these funds for these neighborhoods right now, but any new development fees are going to kind of put it into like one centralized pot and then decide on a system that hasn't been developed yet that we're waiting to hear about. They're going to essentially give out money to the communities that have the most need. So like older communities would get some of the money from that a newer community actually generates.
Right. And so that's
the basic plan.
That's the basic plan. And so it's interesting Thank you. David Graham, former City of San Diego planning director, who's now works for Carlsbad.
Where's
Yeah,
your tie-dye, by the way?
I didn't wear it. I'm sorry.
I tweeted that you'd wear it.
I know. I saw that. I felt guilty about that.
Holding you accountable. Okay.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see that play out, because it is communities often are not thrilled about new development. We see this play out time and again. Folks don't want more traffic in their neighborhood or parking problems or whatever it is. One of the few things that you can hang out as a carrot for those communities is the promise of funding that's going to go to things like parks or libraries or fire stations. So breaking that connection between funding collected in a neighborhood being spent necessarily in that neighborhood is itself interesting. Now, I think there's a very good argument to be made for what they're doing, but it is potentially really, it could change the way some of these conversations play out, I think. Okay, let's.
Comments.
All right, Martha Howard says, the permits to build an additional studio or such in our properties are outrageous. That is a big problem, and it's adding to the housing shortage. Yeah, okay, so an additional cottage, that's, ADUs or granny flats, that's technically separate from the policies that we wrote about this week. But one of the things that we did write about that you're talking about is that the fees that they charge new projects have historically been charged per unit. So if you build a 3-bedroom apartment, that counts as 1 unit, or if you build a studio apartment, that counts as 1 unit. And the fees were, by and large, the same. It was assessed per home, not per bedroom or something like that. And so the city's also making this change to charge the fees by the square foot. And so theoretically, that should incentivize developers to build more smaller units, as opposed to their current incentive structure, which would suggest them to build fewer bigger units. Because if you're gonna pay $1,000 anyway, why pay $1,000 for, it's more than that. But if you were going to pay a hypothetical $1,000 for a unit in fees, well, you'd want to make that money count, and you could build a bigger unit, and that fee would represent a lower percentage of the cost of that unit. But if you're going to be charged by the square foot, well, now you have a natural incentive to say, okay, well, maybe I could build fewer units in here, and then those smaller units would ostensibly be cheaper for a renter or a homeowner.
Can you talk about, Andy, the complete communities part of the plan that excludes single-family housing areas?
Yes.
And what?
Yeah. So the
like I said
at the top. So the complete communities plan, the housing component of the complete communities plan, it is only available to developers who have property that is both within a half a mile of a major transit stop and already zoned to the development of apartments or townhouses. So all of those areas that are zoned for single family homes, that are, the nothing but single family home after single family home, would be ineligible for this project. So now there's some technical reasons for that decision. I understand that basically this, by applying this only to areas that are already zoned for multifamily, it was a little bit easier. You could make the change more quickly. If you were going to allow people to build multifamily housing in an area that is only zoned for single family housing, there's a more complicated analysis required of that, which may have delayed the decision. So there was part of the calculation was just to get something done more quickly. But it does mean that this program that is intended ostensibly to combat systemic inequities, that is intended to, in these different ways, address climate change by making way for more dense housing closer to transit, that in spite of those two goals, it's excluding the most privileged sections of the city and the most climate intensive areas of the city. I mean, single family housing areas are typically auto dependent. That is not typically, and so one thing to think about, I think the areas to think about that you could most easily imagine fitting into this are the single family zoned areas that are near transit, and why single family home areas that are already within a half a mile of high frequency transit, why we wouldn't want them to be part of this program as well if the program is otherwise good. I mean, if you accept the premise that making way for more housing near transit is good, and that using these fees to level the playing field in sort of systemic inequities that have been baked into our land development system for the last 30, 40, 50 years, why would we not want to address that through single family homes, and specifically the single family home areas that are near transit? So I don't know. I think that's something to bear in mind as this issue plays out in front of the city council over the next few months.
So sorry, this means like the incentive would not apply to La Jolla?
It would apply to the areas of La Jolla that are zoned for multifamily, which there are some.
There are, right.
There are some, but if you think about like La Jolla Shores, those like low-lying areas. So we just had a question up on the screen. Isaiah Madison asked, what is the timeline for this proposal to be reviewed by City Council? It is not on the docket yet for a specific City Council meeting, so I can't give you a date. My understanding is that people would like to see it go to the City Council before the August recess, which is mid-August basically. So that would give him, 4 more weeks or something like that. It has already gone through the city's land use committee, but when it did that, they took a relatively unusual step of not making any recommendation. They didn't say, approve this program and make these changes. They just said, there's a lot of moving parts here that we might want to change in the future. We're going to send it back to staff. You guys can keep working on it, and it'll come to the City Council with no recommendation from the committee, which means it's still a very much a wide open conversation. There's a lot of different ways that this could change between now and then, and kind of guessing or forecasting how it might change is a pretty tough situation. I wouldn't be able to do it, honestly.
Yeah, and in terms of the development fee structure change that we talked about earlier, I think we're still waiting on a so-called nexus study that's supposed to lay out exactly how they're going to justify the change.
Yeah. I should specify that the parks part that you covered is on a different track. It's a little bit behind the housing and transportation part. So that'll come through a few weeks or months afterwards. But it's the one that's looking like it might come to the City Council in August, say. That's the housing and transportation focused part specifically.
And I keep asking you, we have more questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jill Shipe Harvey said, talk about the Grateful Dead and I'll stick around. I hope she's still around because we can talk about the Grateful Dead if you want to. Do you want to? Do you have anything to say?
Not really, no.
No? Okay. All right. Well, I'd love to.
Bad OB resident.
Jill, if you're still around and you want some more Grateful Dead talk, ask again. I'll get in there. Will Hunsberg says we are nerds. David Graham says land use wonkery is my favorite. Excellent.
These aren't questions. Could you talk about the transit change? Because that's kind of a big climate change.
Yeah. Graham says he's out when it comes to the dead. Incorrect. That is incorrect. All right. The transit change. A few years ago, the state legislature passed a very wonky but potentially very significant law that said in California they were going to change the way they analyzed the effects on the environment of new development projects. The way California has always assessed those effects is by looking at the street congestion created in the vicinity around a new project. So basically, to what extent do cars travel freely on those roads, and when do they get backed up? And so if your project creates traffic, that's seen as bad, and the project is then asked by the city that it's being built in to address that problem, either by widening the roads or adding a turn lane, or maybe installing a street light, or doing something along those lines that is seen as alleviating that congestion. The goal always being for traffic to flow more freely. Now, if you're thinking about that, as I say, that this is supposed to be the blunting the environmental impact of these developments, obviously cars driving as freely and easily as they can isn't exactly the way we understand environmental friendliness, right? Doesn't quite compute.
No.
Yeah. So that was the logic of this legal change. They said this isn't the right way to do it. The goal shouldn't be to make sure after building your project that all the people there can drive as easily and as often as they want. Instead, the goal should be for us to overall lower the vehicle miles traveled, the amount and the length of car trips associated with this new project. So what is going to spur a lot of car travel from a new project? Well, a project that's very far away from jobs and stores and schools, things that people travel to. If you're 25 miles from the city center, or you're 10 miles from the closest school, that's going to be a lot of driving that is associated with that project. So they have instead, the state is making cities adopt a different analysis, which is a vehicle miles traveled analysis. So they're supposed to measure how much a project contributes to the overall driving in the area. So what does that do for these projects? What projects succeed in that framework? It's projects that are near transit, projects that are near jobs, projects that are near shopping districts, projects that maybe encourage walking, that encourage biking. And so the city had no choice but to adopt a new method of conducting this analysis. It had to do that, but it had some leeway in how exactly it did that. And the way that the city landed on, the way the city has selected to do this, is they created like concentric circles around downtown, that as you get farther away, you have to pay a larger fee for the car travel that you're creating by your project. So the farthest out, the projects out in Rancho Bernardo, truly car-dependent suburbs, would have the largest fee. And projects that are downtown would actually have no fee associated with this. They're just presumed to be projects that by their nature are environmentally friendly, that by virtue of the level of car travel that they would create. And so again, it's kind of a wealth transfer, especially because all this money, all these fees that they would pay for being built in these areas would go back into projects that would theoretically contribute to less driving. So they would charge a fee in a simplified version. A new single-family housing project, 10 new single-family homes in Rancho Bernardo, would have to pay a fee based on the fact that it's presumed that a lot of those people are in those homes are going to drive a lot. They'll pay a fee based on that driving, and that money will go to the city, which they'll use to build bike lanes in North Park. So it is a wealth transfer from suburbs to more urban areas for the purpose of lessening car travel. I think that is in the spirit of what the state law wanted and what proponents of that law think is the right set of policy priorities. But it's also going to be politically controversial, I think. And at that committee hearing, Mark Kersey, who represents a lot of those areas in the suburban parts of the northern and eastern parts of the city, sort of indicated that was a no-go for him, that the logic of that wasn't going to be something he could wrap his head around and would be willing to vote for. So that's another thing that I just don't know exactly how that works out when it comes down to the city council voting on it.
It's kind of like sounds kind of like a carbon tax, or it's sort of in a way.
It's very. I mean, it's not, but it functions the same way, right? And in the same way that when people defend a carbon tax, what they say is, well, look, people can drive if they want, but they're going to be taxed for that activity, and then we're going to use that tax to benefit the programs that would make it possible for them to not drive. And so in that way, it really is analogous, I would say.
Yeah. Did you have any more questions? I can't see the chat box.
There are no more questions. But last point on the Grateful Dead, I will just say that September 9th, 10th, and 11th run in 1991 was a really good stretch. Some of the best Bruce Hornsby shows. Was listening to those recently.
Some of the worst land use policies in that area, probably.
91, yeah. Well said. Yes, that was
maybe not the worst. Maybe not the worst.
A real greenfield development area. We have one. We have one. Liz Shope said people in other areas of San Diego than downtown do not necessarily drive to downtown. Yeah, that's absolutely true. They don't necessarily drive to downtown. They don't necessarily drive at all. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions being made in these proposals. Now, there are assumptions that are backed by data, but it's correlations, not 100%. And so it's not a one-to-one fee for use charge. They're basically just saying on the whole, people in outlying areas drive more, and so they're going to be responsible for a larger fee burden.
And this is only for housing developments. Like, there's a lot of jobs located out in those suburban areas, right? I have friends who live in the urban core, but then drive 25 minutes to Rancho Bernardo, for instance, or whatever, for their job. So it's kind of a.
Dave Gibbs wants to know, why was the Loyal referred to as a professional-ish soccer team in this morning's email? Did you do that, MacKenzie? Was that your joke in the morning report? I think it was. Yes. Yeah, it was just a joke, Dave.
It's just
sorry.
a joke.
It was.
I don't think the MLS is a very professional league anyway.
Well, they're not MLS.
That's very controversial.
They're US.
Exactly.
But they're USL.
So right.
Okay. But yes, Liz, to your question about people not necessarily driving downtown, that is true. I also add that one group of institutional developers, one of the exceptions they took to this policy was that this is not that this was not the only way you had to charge the vehicle miles traveled fee, and that essentially, if you incentivize more jobs to locate near those suburban homes, then it wouldn't necessarily be the case that those suburban homes created more vehicle miles traveled, which I think is true. But again, I would probably say that it is by and large true, although not exclusively true. And so, but yes, and to your point that they don't necessarily go downtown, and maybe they drive from Rancho Bernardo to UTC. There's a lot of, actually, I think there's more jobs in UTC than there are downtown in San Diego right now, and especially UTC Golden Triangle area.
I mean, that's reflective of the congestion in the morning, isn't it? On I-5.
Yeah, you see it. Yeah, it's a reverse commute in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And San Diego is a multi-employment centered city. It doesn't have the classic morning commute system of like New York City or Boston or East Coast cities, where people drive or take transit from the suburbs into the city and then back from the city out to the suburbs every day. We're kind of going in multiple directions at any given time, all of which makes urban planning much more complicated out here. And we haven't done a great job of it, frankly, over the last 50 years of our history. All right, there are no more questions coming through. Dave, saw that you said no big deal. This is the only flack we got for it. But
the UFL comment or
USL comment, yeah. If anybody
USL, sorry,
definitely take it up with MacKenzie. She is the person who made that joke.
Yeah, I'm happy to take your.
She has high standards in her soccer.
I'm much more into Liga Femenil anyway, so.
Okay.
So yeah, hit me up in an email if you want to argue.
All right, Steve Verissimo has a question. Is the definition of national public city buses in the trolley? Steve, so the definition of transit in this case is either any rail line, so any rail line of any kind, which is the trolley basically, or 2 city bus lines that run at 15 minutes or better frequency. So you can't just have one bus line that comes every hour and say, oh, look, there's transit here. We can build dense housing nearby. It has to be 2 bus lines that both have relatively frequent headways. Why incentive to build near them when ridership is so low? Because the goal is to raise ridership. So the reason you have an incentive to build them when ridership is low is because the hope is that ridership will increase because it's better for the environment. Riders tend to be lower income, thus lower income level to afford housing. Correct. And that is why we would like to give those lower income people more housing opportunities in more desirable areas that are more accessible to jobs and shopping, grocery stores, good schools, etc. So yes, the answer to all of that is transit is defined based on its frequency. We want to make it easier to build there so that more people ride transit and can improve the environment. And the fact that riders are low income is part of the reason that this is a priority. All right, that's about all we have right now.
Good reporting, Andy.
Thanks. If anybody has any other questions for us, hit us up in email. Anybody else has any problems with or thoughts about Fish or Grateful Dead, you can send those to me. Women's soccer, send those to MacKenzie. I think that's about it.
We've hit everything, yeah.
All right, sounds good. Okay. Meg, can you play Free by Fish to take us away?